Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Dr. Alfred W. McCoy. Last name is McCoy. And I'm really delighted to have him. He's just published a new book. If you're watching this on YouTube, X, Rumble, or Rockfin, you'll see the cover of his new book. The full title is Cold War on Five Continents, A Global History of Empire and Espionage. And Dr. McCoy has been teaching at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for, I think, 30 years now. And he holds the Fred Harvey Harrington Professorship of History. And I was looking through his past, and he's really famous for an earlier book. The full title of that book is The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, CIA Complicity in the Global Drug Trade. It's really one of the great books of post-World War II history, such an important book. And Tommy wrote it when he was very young. I think he was only 24, 25. But it's not that was one of his first books. I think he wrote something about Laotia before that. But his other books, some of which I found interesting. I've read through his other books, actually interesting, which is A Question of Torture, CIA Interrogation from the Cold War to the War on Terror. That was 2006. There's literally a whole chapter on mind control in there, but it overlaps with some of my research myself. Another book is Policing America's Empire, the United States, the Philippines, and the Rise of the Surveillance State. He also has one of his family history involves brewing, and that book is Beer of Broadway Fame, the Peel Family and their Brooklyn Brewery. Another is The Shadows of the American Century, the Rise and Decline of U.S. Global Power. That's 2017. Another is To Govern the Globe, World Orders and Catastrophic Change. 2021 seems very timely. Another one is The War on Drugs, Studies in the Failure of U.S. Narcotics Policy, 2021. And then again, today we're going to talk about this book that just dropped January 6th, 2025. The full title again is Cold War on Five Continents, A Global History of Empire and Espionage. And so Dr. Alfred W. McCoy, welcome to the show.
William, thanks for having me. By the way, William, if you're William, I'm Al. So why don't you just call me Al? Okay.
Okay. For people who haven't heard your name or your illustrious career, maybe you can talk about what led up to the publication of this most recent book, Cold War on Five Continents.
There's a direct connection at a conceptual level between my first book and my most recent book. At the age of 26, I set out around the globe to investigate CIA alliances with drug lords, particularly in Southeast Asia. Most people have forgotten in 1970 and 71, there was a massive heroin epidemic that swept the U.S. Army troops fighting in South Vietnam. A subsequent White House survey of 1,000 veterans from 1971 determined that 34%, 1/3 of all U.S. combat forces in South Vietnam were regular heroin users. In a word, they were junkies. The 82nd Airborne, a very distinguished combat unit, back in that day was known as the Jumpin' Junkies of the 82nd Airborne. There were more heroin addicts in the U.S. Army in South Vietnam than there were in the entire continental United States. So it was a massive heroin epidemic. And the question is, where was the heroin coming from? Rumors were that the North Vietnamese were shipping it down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, along with their armaments, in order to destroy the U.S. Army from within. So I got a contract from a book publisher. I was then a graduate student at Yale University, working on my footnotes, and I stepped out of the library and went on a journey 1.5 times around the globe. And what I discovered was that the CIA, for reasons of operational imperatives, were allied with a number of drug lords in what was known as the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia. More particularly, the CIA was fielding a very effective militia of people called the Hmong, who are now Hmong Americans, and they were holding back communist forces in northern Laos from capturing the capital of Laos, Vientiane. And the Hmong grew 2 crops. They were agriculturalists. They were highland farmers. They grew 2 crops, rice for subsistence and opium for cash. And opium, of course, is the ingredient. The morphine in opium becomes diacetyl morphine, which is the chemical name for heroin. and CIA helicopters were carrying the drugs. So I went around the world, and I went into the mountains of Laos, and I went into an opium growing village that was providing soldiers for the CIA. CIA sent a squad of men that tried to assassinate me. It was an incredible adventure, and it culminated in the publication of the book. And then when the book was in press, the CIA wasn't done with me. The man who was probably the most powerful media figure in the United States at that time, a man named Cord Meyer Jr., who was the #2 in the covert division of the CIA. He was basically the head of CIA covert operations, a man named Cord Meyer Jr. He called at the offices of my publisher. He knew my publisher well because they'd worked on the UN treaty together in 1945. And he asked the head of the publishing firm to suppress my book because he claimed that my book was going to destroy and damage U.S. national security. Anyway, so that got me into another entanglement with the CIA. And by the time it was all done, the book was published unaltered. And not only was that, it was an extraordinary adventure. I mean, one month I'm sitting in Sterling Memorial Library at Yale reading musty documents, a kind of what's back in the day they were known as library rats. Okay. And then another day I'm going around the globe meeting covert operatives in France, in South Vietnam, in Laos, and in the United States. And that whole experience immersed me into what I now call the covert netherworld, this space between the visible politics on the surface of society and this underground. Okay, and it introduced me to some of the most famous covert operatives of the era. And then there was something truly extraordinary that happened to me when I was writing the book. I was, after this great adventure of going around the globe, I was literally in my garret in my attic apartment in New Haven, Connecticut, and there was a knock on the door, and this massive guy who had a bulge under his shoulder, which was a shoulder holster, introduced himself. He said his name was Tom Tripodi. He was from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. They had heard that I was writing a book that might cause them problems, and could he come and talk to me? So I don't know why, because actually Tom was actually a very nice guy, and so I invited him in, and I don't know what he told the DA, but we had some conversations, and I realized he was pretty knowledgeable. He told me that before he worked for the DA, he'd been a CIA operative, and he'd been assigned to the Cuba operation in Florida. So this was a career covert operative. He later went undercover for the DA. He was Italian American and fluent in Sicilian, and he went undercover in Sicily for the Drug Enforcement Administration, where they were trying to break the mafia's hold on heroin. So this man was a master spy. And he gave me a kind of seminar, a crash course. He came back a half a dozen times. He asked to see the manuscript. I said, sure, why not? And he would sit there and read it, kind of proof it, and then he would tell me what was right and what was wrong. Told me all kinds of anecdotes, and it was kind of a master class in covert operations. And so by the time I finished that book, I'd not only published a book, but I'd had an introduction to this covert netherworld. And from that introduction, I've been able to pursue my career writing about various aspects of espionage, the surveillance in one book that you mentioned, torture, another book that you mentioned, okay? And this book that I wrote, The Cold War on 5 Continents, is the conceptual sequel to that first book. Now, when I started writing this book, about 3 years ago, I naturally came across the name of Edward Lansdale, CIA operative, whom I'd interviewed for the Politics of Heroin. And when I got to the French and Indochina, naturally I came across the name of Roger Trinquier, who was the head of Highland covert operations during the French Indochina War from 1946 to 1954. Suddenly, the memories of my interaction with them back in 1971 came flooding back. Now, back then, I'd just done the interviews and I'd gotten the basics of time, person, and place, the facts of the matter. And I'd put those facts into my book, and that became the book Politics of Heroin. But now, the memories of them came back based upon a deeper understanding of this covert netherworld. And I began to see not just time, person, and place, but I began to see a fourth dimension to them, their dimension as critical historical actors in the Cold War. Now, historians all know one thing, okay? And if you talk to any historian, they'll tell you that, biographies are very nice, but in the complex working out of climate change and economic forces and diplomacy and all the rest, all the multitudinous forces that make up historical change, there is one clear rule. Individuals do not make a difference. The doings of kings, of generals, all the rest, yeah, they're sort of important, but they don't actually make for historical change, okay? And what I found in writing this book was that the Cold War provided a really significant exception to that rule. Okay, what happened was, okay, the book operates on two levels. It operates on this grand geopolitical level, and then it operates at this gritty level of covert action and espionage. Okay, so the grand geopolitics. Okay, and this is very important to understand the Cold War. The Cold War was perfectly coincident with another great historical process called decolonization. Okay, at the start of the Cold War, about 40% of the Earth's surface was colonies. There were 140 plus colonies around the world. 1/3 of the world's population lived as colonized peoples. And between 1946 and 1993, the world decolonized. These 6 great empires broke apart and became 100 new nations. Today, at the UN, there's about 190 new nations. So half the nations in the world today are former colonies. All right. And this process coincided with the Cold War. And when Cold War conflict and decolonization came together, that produced a major geopolitical rupture, a kind of a void in the world system. So all of the greater global forces were pushed aside in this moment of rupture. And that allowed individual covert operatives, British, French, Dutch, Vietnamese, Chilean, all the rest, to suddenly leave their fingerprints on the crime scenes of world history, to actually make historical change. And so that's the way, that's the sort of half the book explores that dynamic, these geopolitical ruptures, and then these extraordinary opportunities for individuals to actually do something that is very uncommon, to actually make history, to make history happen.
Right. You call them men on the spot. So, and there's a
Right.
lot of Lansdale's one of them. I didn't know you interviewed him. I've done a number of episodes about him, known as the Ugly American, but like his history is incredible, including the Philippines and then into Vietnam right there. So he's always around. And, associate friends with Dolas and all these CIA operatives and stuff like that. Like he's a remarkable figure. Um,
But, Lansdale is rather typical. Uh, here in the United States, at home, Lansdale was next to a nobody, okay? But overseas, in the midst of, in one of those geopolitical ruptures where an individual could write his writ on human history, that's when Lansdale became Lansdale, right? And he had two of those opportunities.
Right. He was there in the psychological operations, the espionage he was involved in, like the whole vampire stories of the backcountry in the Philippines, and just all these things are really incredible. And really, he was really involved in installing one of the prime ministers, right? Was it Magsaysay or can't remember the guy's name.
Lansdale had two moments where he acted as a man on the spot. Okay. In 1946, the United States gave the Philippines independence. And then almost immediately, a major communist revolution by peasant guerrillas called the Hooks erupted. And the United States essentially sent Lansdale as one of two American operatives to assist the Philippine defense minister in creating a strategy that could defeat a very serious communist revolution. And you got to understand that this was very serious for the United States because the home port for the U.S. 7th Fleet, which was one of two great fleets designed to contain the communists behind the Iron Curtain, was home ported in the Philippines. So if the communists won, we would lose Subic Bay, and there goes a strategic anchor of our position, our containment position globally. So it was very serious. Lansdale worked very effectively with McSci. He had a brilliant offsider who was an anthropologist and a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army named Colonel Charles Bohannon. And together they concocted a strategy of manipulating the folk culture of the Philippines to break the hook psychologically. They also worked with McSci, who was actually a very skillful defense minister. And Lansdale always overshadows McSci. McSci was the real talent in this. He was the real architect of this strategy. Anyway, he reformed the Philippine Army and made them a very effective counter-guerrilla force. And to Lansdale's psychological operations, combined with McSci's effective military reforms, beat the hooks. And this was a stunning event, okay, in world history. Suddenly, a major communist revolution was defeated not by sending 100,000 U.S. troops, but by sending one covert operative. And it was that one, with the almost simultaneous success of the CIA in Iran, that signaled to the Eisenhower administration that the way to fight the Cold War was not to send the troops, but was to send these covert operatives. Okay.
Right. You mentioned Kermit Roosevelt too. That was the man on the spot in Iran, right? 1953.
Yeah, that was another case. Kermit Roosevelt was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a Middle Eastern specialist. He served in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II in the Middle East. And then he later, after the war, joined the CIA. So he had a Middle Eastern specialization. And when the Iranians nationalized the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is now British Petroleum, BP, the British tried everything. They tried gunboat diplomacy. They took the case to the UN. They took their case to the international, the International Permanent Court of Arbitration, and they lost everywhere. And so they resorted to covert operations, and the British MI6 proposed an alliance to overthrow the Prime Minister of Iran, who had nationalized the oil company. And Kermit Roosevelt flew to Lebanon, got in a car by himself, put $100,000 in Iranian currency in the trunk, and drove across the deserts of Syria and Iraq, crossed into Iran, and fomented a coup that overthrew the Mossadegh government and installed the Shah in power, no longer just reigning over Iran, but actually ruling it. And so when Kermit Roosevelt came back to Washington and regaled the Eisenhower White House with his tale of covert action daring do, you got to remember who Eisenhower was. Dwight Eisenhower was the supreme commander of Allied powers in Europe during World War II, right? And he sacrificed several million soldiers with two objectives. He wanted to accomplish regime change in just two countries: oust Benito Mussolini in Italy and oust Adolf Hitler in Germany. And to do that, he fought this horrific campaign that left a path of destruction and death. And now what he's seeing is that he wanted to do regime change in Iran. And instead of sending troops to their death, one covert operative accomplishes this miracle, and only 300 lives are lost, 300 Iranians, during the rioting takes place. And to Eisenhower, this seems, as you can imagine, something of a miracle. And so the Eisenhower administration, to the best of my knowledge, right, this is Dwight Eisenhower, career military officer, commander of U.S. forces during World War II in Europe, right? He only authorized one conventional military operation during his 8 years in office, and that was the dispatch of troops to Lebanon in 1958. But he authorized over 170 covert operations that we know about. And so because of the work of Kermit Roosevelt and Edward Lansdale, these two masterful men on the spot, showing that what could be accomplished by individuals, this became the primary mode, the primary means of U.S. force projection during the whole of the Cold War. And that moved the Cold War from conventional forces into this clandestine covert realm, which makes the men on the spot so significant during the Cold War.
On 5 continents. So it's solidified in Europe after World War II, 1945, and then in this process of decolonization, where everything kind of was up for grabs. It seems like a lot of everywhere. This whole espionage and covert Cold War written in blood, like that's how you finalize the book. But a lot of, maybe not as deadly as World War II, but a lot of really amazing things happened. And these aren't just the other one. I mean, it's Lansdale, Roosevelt. You have a lot of different names there that are involved in these types of, some that I didn't really know, actually. Some of the names of these men on the spot, but like Devlin in Greece, Stockwell in Angola, I believe, or somewhere in
that's right.
And then there's other kind of guys who are involved in the Cold War. Westerling, Redaway, and Stockwell became a CIA critic. Like there's videos of him around, kind of explaining what the CIA did too.
Yeah, Stockwell is is actually part of a kind of a subtype of people that got recruited to the CIA. The most useful people living abroad in these faraway places were missionary kids, the children of missionaries that grew up in these far-flung areas, and that spoke local languages and had empathy. And in an era when we were practicing Jim Crow in the United States, in an era when the U.S. Army was, until 1948, segregated. And prior to that, it was only very special selected white officers that were allowed to command African American troops, because most of them were dyed-in-the-wool racists, and you wouldn't have been effective commanders. So these missionary kids had this curious bicultural capacity, and they were recruited by the CIA. And the problem with them, I found two of them: William Young in the mountains of Laos, grandson of a Baptist missionary, and John Stockwell, the son of Presbyterian missionaries in the Congo. The problem is because they spoke local languages, they had local friends, their cultural loyalties were kind of divided. They're all very loyal Americans on the surface, but culturally, they look at these people that they're supposed to be manipulating as real people whom they actually care about. And so, none of them work out. The Mish kids, as they were called, tend not to work out over the long term. And Stockwell was one. So when the United States decided we would intervene in Angola and prevent a Marxist government from replacing the Portuguese colonial regime as the government in the capital, Lusaka, they sent out Stockwell. And Stockwell, very quickly began shipping in arms to surrogate anti-communist forces in Angola. And over the long term, as he watched this unfold, he describes in his memoirs a moment, a kind of epiphany, like Paul on the road to Tarsus. He was standing on a railroad, the actual Lobito Railroad, that goes from the copper mines of Katanga province in southern Congo across the whole of Angola to the port of Lobito, okay, which the U.S. is actually now rehabilitating. And Stockwell was standing there, and he looks down this railroad line that stretches to the horizon, and he can feel himself being uplifted, so he can see 1,000 miles across the magnificence of Africa, from the sparkling blue waters of the Lobito ports to the dusty bushlands of Katanga province in Congo, and feeling the power of Mother Africa juxtaposed against the tawdriness of these covert operations, their cynicism, their manipulation, their fundamental falsity of what they're promising their participants. He can't do it anymore, and he quits. And he spends a decade, agencies sued him, they bankrupted him with their lawsuits, and Stockwell just went from campus to campus across America, trying to get Americans to become aware of the ambiguity, the moral ambiguity of covert operations and what was being done in their name. And he never quite succeeded, but it was an admirable effort.
I think he started a foundation or something like that to really combat American imperialistic kind of ideas. I think he's still with us,
Oh
actually.
yes, no, he's
Yeah.
he's alive.
He's around. I tried to find him. I know because like his biographies, like one of the interesting things I saw in your book was all these guys' memoirs and stuff. But his biographies on archive as well. So like
Yep.
they're still around. Yeah.
His book. I teach a course on the CIA and the Cold War, and his chapters from his book "In Search of Enemies" about the Angola operation are required reading for my students.
Wow.
He writes well. It's very gripping, actually.
He explains Mockingbird. He explains all these techniques. He's on video, so like people can see like all his stuff. He really left a great repository of videos. He's a really
Oh,
interesting guy.
speaking of videos, he's got one that's really gripping. Okay. Um, he's taught he between his time of being an operative in Central Africa and running the Angola operation. In 1974-75, he was assigned to South Vietnam, and he was assigned to a province called Tay Ninh, which is on the Cambodian border. And in early 1975, as the case officer head of Tay Ninh province, he began to notice that North Vietnamese forces were concentrating in his area, and he realized that they were massing to capture Saigon. And so he describes how he gets on an aircraft, he flies down to Saigon from Tay Ninh province, and he has an urgent meeting with his CIA superior to explain to his CIA superior the immediate threat that is amassing from intelligence he's gathering literally on the ground of this impending attack, which is the attack which, by the way, captured Saigon and cost us, made us suffer a defeat in Vietnam. And so he describes how this is a little bit gross, and I apologize, but this is history. His CIA superior takes him to a bar, and he insists that Stockwell brief him while he's having an appetizer of oral sex. I mean, and at that point, Stockwell realized that the agency and the operatives are kind of what we call, corrupt imperialists. That they've lost their moral fiber, detached from the United States and the restraints of this society. It's a really very gripping video that
And if I can find that.
yeah, I have it. If you look on the footnotes of my book, you'll find the URL.
I'll find it. Gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they really kind of like a lot of amoral decisions were made that
Yeah.
resulted in the deaths of thousands, if not millions, of people all
Actually,
throughout. Yeah.
William, that was one thing you mentioned that this wasn't. You said earlier that this wasn't as bloody as World War II, and that's accurate. Okay, but in terms of mass mortality, the biggest in human history is World War II, with about 70 million dead. The next biggest is the Cold War, because when you add up all these little wars like Korean War and the Vietnam War and all the rest, the total on mortality and these surrogate wars, these brushfire wars fought away from Europe and the United States, is about 20 million people, which makes the Cold War the second most bloody conflict in human history. And it's these bloody local conflicts, often forgotten, that I'm documenting in my book, Cold War on Five Continents.
Right, and it's just all over. I mean, you talk about Africa's one example, South South America, Chile, just constant fighting. Letelier. I mean, one of the interesting ones is I found the video. Let me see if I can bring it up. The Chile is a good example of this covert operator. I can't remember what his name. You feature him in the book, but like the application of force against the Allende government, it was like the shock doctrine was like very minimal lives lost with really thorough, overthrow of Chile and what the original 9/11, right, 1973.
Yep. In the Chile operation, basically what happened was in 1970, Chileans in a democratic election elected a socialist prime minister who had about 5 members of the Chilean Communist Party in his cabinet, because the Communist Party had backed him during the election. And so having a socialist in Latin America, the U.S. sphere of influence, set off alarm bells ringing in Washington, D.C. And President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, were determined to overthrow this government. And ultimately, the operation came down to uh, a, a man on the spot, a man named Thomas Karamessines, who emerged as a man on the spot. Yeah, that's the one. I wouldn't suggest we play it now
Okay.
because
I'll just give people an idea of what Stockwell looked like. He's
okay, yeah,
kind of a cutout.
because the description is actually a little bit gross, frankly.
Okay. But you can find videos if people want to follow up on this. They can just check out Stockwell. Yeah. Sorry.
Very interesting man. Very
Yeah,
interesting man.
yeah.
Grew up in Congo, speak the Shaluba language, had all those cultural empathies, and unable to sustain the Cold War. But turning to Chile,
Karamessinas. I think he had
Thomas
Greek
Kerr.
last name, right?
Yeah, he was known as Tommy the Greek and that network back in the day. Anyway, Karamessinis was Greek American, grew up in New York, went to Columbia University, and he was a deputy prosecutor to the famous anti-mafia crime fighter Thomas Dewey, later governor of New York State, failed presidential candidate. And then Karamessinis joined the OSS, and he wound up in Athens. And because he was fluent in Greek from his childhood, he was suddenly a very effective operative. And he was the CIA's chief operative during the Greek Civil War when the United States sent military advisors to block communist guerrillas from taking power. And he formed very deep attachments to the Greek right wing, who had been allies and instruments of the Nazi occupation of Greece during World War II. He moved on to Italy, same thing. Italy had had a fascist government from 1922 to 1943. So there were lots of ex-fascists lying around in various secret societies. Karamessinis worked effectively with them. And through this all, he got a kind of training in the clandestine arts. So by the time he became head of CIA covert operations, the CIA had 4 directorates in that day, 4 divisions, if you will. And there was one called the Directorate of Plans, which was a euphemism for covert ops. And that was Thomas Karamessinis. So he had the contract, the job, the assignment of overthrowing Pinochet. And given all of his experience, he did a very effective job of doing so. And once, sorry, not overthrowing Pinochet, overthrowing Salvador Allende, the socialist, and installing General Pinochet in power. And once that was done, then a second operative became very significant. Now, Pinochet's government did something extraordinary. They set up something called Operation Condor that became a anti-communist centralized intelligence network. The CIA provided the communications infrastructure to allow communications between about 7 Latin American intelligence services at a time when there were lots of military juntas as the dominant form of government in Latin America. And they set out to systematically destroy the left in Latin America. And the sum of people that they assassinated, incarcerated, is about 500,000 people. It's extraordinary, Operation Condor. And we actually have the archive of that, which was discovered in a Paraguayan police station moldering away. So we have accurate knowledge about it. And one of the things they did was they had assassins. If exiles had fled one government to another government or somewhere else, Operation Condor dispatched assassins. And the top assassin for Operation Condor was an expatriate American named Michael Vernon Townley. And he ran an assassination campaign. He assassinated, blew up the former chief of staff of the Chilean army in Buenos Aires. He arranged a shooting of an exiled Democratic Socialist leader. And in Washington, D.C., he actually did the bombing of the former Chilean defense minister in downtown Washington, D.C. And there's a monument there to
Sheridan Circle, Letelier, right?
Yep.
Letelier.
Yeah.
It's a really good book called The Ghost of Sheridan Circle. I did have the historian on about that. It's really fascinating and it involves Townley. That's why when I saw his picture in your book, I was like, oh, that's the guy. That's him.
Yeah. And he was a man on the spot. And again, in the book I document 30 of them, and there's 18 of them are American, and Townley is, I count him Chilean, because at the time he was a Chilean citizen working for Chilean security service. And that was an interesting inversion that, an intelligence service in the periphery, right, creating this massive Condor apparatus with CIA technology, and then reaching into the metropole and conducting an assassination in Washington, D.C. That was extraordinary. And that's, I think, indicative of how pervasive this covert realm had become during the Cold War. It wasn't just our guys acting in faraway, dusty places. It was a whole apparatus, a whole coterie of covert operatives. And actually, if you wouldn't mind, William, that does remind me of another very significant covert operative that, would you mind me talking about?
Yeah, please continue. Yeah.
Okay, all right. We've talked very briefly about Edward Lansdale, the quiet American, the ugly American. He was the most famous covert operative of the 1950s and 1960s. There were two feature films. There was one called The Quiet American, and Lansdale was actually involved in the production of that, and he's featured in there. And then there's one called An Ugly American, based basically on the Lansdale story, in which Lansdale the Lansdale figure is played by Marlon Brando. So he was really famous in the day. And when Lansdale's second major success, the one that made him truly famous, was after he defeated the Hooks and installed Ramon Magsaysay, his partner in defeating the Hook communist guerrillas in the Philippines. After he installed him in the presidential palace, manipulated the Philippine elections to get his buddy elected president of the Philippines. He then moved on to Saigon, and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles gave him a blanket instruction saying, do what you did in the Philippines. So Lansdale in South Vietnam, again, identified a likely surrogate, kind of his Ramon Magsaysay in the form of No Dinh Diem. And he defeated the French military. Diem was very unpopular in Washington, D.C. He defeated his superiors in Washington, D.C. He defeated the Sino-Vietnamese crime syndicate that ran Saigon. He defeated them all and installed No Dinh Diem in power in South Vietnam. And this was his great triumph. Again, regime change done largely by one man. And that was Lansdale's shining success. Lansdale had a curious attribute that he gained from his time in the Philippines. He was always very open to working with the locals in a way that most CIA operatives weren't. He cultivated big networks. I went through his correspondence at the Hoover Institution and found at one point when he left Manila in 1948, before he came back on a covert assignment, he wrote thank you notes to 50 senior Filipinos in amazing walks of life, an incredible social network for basically a middle-ranking military officer. Okay, so he had this real skill. So when he was in Saigon, he found this. He encountered this guy named Phan Xuan An, whom he thought would be a likely acolyte, and he trained him in tradecraft. And then there was something called the Asia Foundation, which was a CIA front, and he got a scholarship for Phan Xuan An to come to California and studied at Orange Coast Community College, which was, a third-tier American institution. But very importantly, Phan Xuan An functioned in the United States as an American student for a year, and he became acculturated. And again, this process of acculturation and making these agents, as we said, with Stockwell, all right, it's very important. So he gained nuance and understanding of Americans and American society. He went back to Saigon. He had been a communist officer in the Viet Minh, the Communist Party's front group that had risen in revolt against the French. He was enrolled. He took his oath before a man that became the head of the Communist Party in Vietnam, and he was a dedicated communist spy. And he then got a job in media and eventually wound up being a reporter for Time magazine. And when the U.S. troops started coming to Vietnam in the early 1960s, Phan Xuan An, as a reporter, began collecting intelligence. And all of the major North Vietnamese victories from 1962 to 1972, and indeed their ultimate victory in 1975, was a result of the intelligence gained by Phan Xuan An.
Wow.
Okay? All right. And so here's a case where Lansdale, had put ZM in power, great success, and then he cultivated this inconsequential relationship, not very important. This minor Vietnamese would-be journalist, right? And Phan Xuan An, when in 1975, he was bureau chief of Time magazine. And in 1976, he retired from Time and he went to Hanoi. And the famous Vietnamese defense minister, Vo Nguyen Giap, the man who defeated the French and defeated the Americans, gave him a star as a general in the Vietnamese army. And he was awarded 16 medals, one for each of his major victories. All right.
Wow.
And he had
like
written
Philby or something, Philby of the Orient or something.
Oh, he put Philby to shame.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's font Pham. His last name is An, at least in the American spelling or English.
Yes, English. Yeah. An extraordinary success. He operated as an individual operative. So he was basically Hanoi's man on the spot in South Vietnam. Right?
Incredible.
Okay. A complete flip. Trained by one man on the spot to become the enemy's man on the spot.
Wow.
And during his career as an operative, he wouldn't hold documents because he recognized that could implicate him. So what he did was he purloined documents, put them back, and then he would write up reports. Okay. And he would type them up, and then he would photograph them, because as a journalist, he was a good photographer, and he put them on a roll of exposed film, and then hand them off to a courier. And the couriers would take it out to the famous tunnels of Cu Chi outside Saigon, and then couriers would hand carry that across the border into Cambodia to Phnom Penh and be flown to Hanoi. And of the 40 couriers that he had, about 25 were captured and killed. All right. But the network was insulated enough so that they never got him. Wow, an extraordinary, one of the most brilliant stories of espionage. And actually, that brings me again to the idea of the significance of all this. So what does this all add up to? Okay. Let's just take one case. All right. And here's a controversial and ultimately unsustainable hypothesis. Okay. Historical hypothesis. So a large question might be, and a lot of people have asked it, how and why did the United States lose the Vietnam War? How can the world's greatest military power at the peak of its power in the 1960s lose a war to a poor, impoverished country like North Vietnam of 16 million people with no industrial base whatsoever? How can this happen? And when you look at the history of combat, indeed, whenever the armies met on the field of battle, the U.S. firepower was so overwhelming that we won every battle, every single battle, except for maybe one or two minor battles. But when the big ones, we won it. The Tet Offensive, we won. It looked like a spectacular enemy victory. No. We slaughtered them. We won that. We destroyed the Viet Cong's militia infrastructure in that battle. So we won every battle and lost the war. And how can that happen? Well, we lost the war because we lost the intelligence war. We lost the underground war. And the man who was the head of what's called Order of Battle Intelligence for the Viet Cong Communist Underground, a man named Samuel Adams, okay, published a book and a brilliant article in which he said, based upon his work in the CIA, that the Viet Cong had 30,000 spies buried inside the South Vietnamese government. He said that that some of these spies had even taken over what was something called the Phoenix Program. The Phoenix Program was the CIA's secret program of torture, interrogation, and assassination designed to destroy the Viet Cong underground. The CIA admits that the Phoenix Program killed over 20,000 South Vietnamese suspected communists. If you add the number killed by the South Vietnamese when they took over the program, the Phoenix Program killed 41,000 communist suspects. And yet, CIA veterans state that never in the entire history of the Phoenix program did we capture a single high-ranking communist spy. So who were we killing? Well, the communists took over a number of the Phoenix program branches, and they were slaughtering our allies. They were putting our people into it. They'd flipped it like all good counterintelligence did. They flipped Phoenix and they turned it into an instrument for the destruction of the U.S. position in Vietnam. So basically, imagine 30,000 communist agents. One of them is Phan Xuan An, and we know the damage he did. So we lost that underground war. And can I tell you a story, an anecdote about?
Please do.
Okay. Now, so my argument is simple. Why did we lose the Vietnam War? Well, we won the conventional combat, but we lost the underground war. The U.S. Army won the war and the CIA lost it, okay? To put it simply, all right? And now where did I get this idea? Okay, got it like this. When I was in a boarding school in New England, and I was on the junior varsity wrestling team, I was a sophomore. Our captain was a guy named John Merson. He was a good guy. He went to Amherst College and he dropped out and wound up a lance corporal in Vietnam, up near the demilitarized zone. And he published a memoir. And when it was in press, he heard that I was teaching a course on the Vietnam War. So he sent me the manuscript for comment to see if there was anything wrong. And so I was reading the manuscript. And this is a guy I'd known in high school that I'd been on the wrestling team with, right? And he gets to this passage where he says, they got intelligence that sampans, canoes, would be coming down a stream or a river at a certain time and place. And so he took his squad and they took their machine guns and their M16s and their grenade launchers, and they set up what he called a killing zone. And in the dark of night, the sampans came down the river and they opened up, and then they turned on the lights and there were 20 dead people, except they weren't communist guerrillas. They were women and children and old men. And Merson and his Marine squad were horrified. And they spent the rest of the war hiding in villages, friendly villages. They wouldn't fight anymore. They just hid. And then when their time was up, they came home. Okay, so I read that passage. And about a month later, it was Christmas vacation. And we had a family reunion in Bermuda. My brother-in-law was the Chief Justice of Bermuda, so we used to meet there. And we were sitting on a beach, and I decided to tell my stepfather, Kruger Bright, who was a Marine Corps veteran, a 30-year veteran of the Marine Corps. And his last assignment, he started off as a pilot in the Solomon Islands in World War II, and he was in 4 wars with the Marine Corps. His last assignment, he was Deputy Chief of Intelligence in the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. He was the Deputy Chief of Intelligence under General Westmoreland, okay? And so I said, Kruger, let me tell you, you're a Marine, let me tell you this terrible story. So I told him the story, and like that, he shoots back at me. He says, good counterintelligence by the enemy. I said, what do you mean, Kruger? He said, well, think about it, okay? Everything was right about the intelligence, except for one thing. They weren't soldiers, they were women and children. So what happens? What's the gain? Villages upstream hate America. Okay? The soldiers demoralize. Win-win for the enemy. And if a Viet Cong militia unit in a remote locale could pull that kind of counterintelligence, what could the real counterintelligence professionals do? Okay, and it was at that point I began to realize that we were up against an army of people that were absolutely dedicated to their goal and that were very sophisticated. They'd been trained by the Soviets in very sophisticated counterintelligence techniques. And it was that point I realized that this is real, that this counterintelligence failure on the part of the United States was potentially critical in our overall defeat. And so the men on the spot made a difference.
Right, in this kind of cloak and dagger environment, this underground, not these above ground on top of the table, as opposed to sub rosa conflicts, like playing out psychological warfare and putting people in power and this back and forth. There really is an incredible tapestry when you think about this conflict over 5 continents, right? The only continents left out are Australia and Antarctica. So it's really a global war, which leads us up to today. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff and a lot of this history is incredibly relevant to what's happening, even in Iran. Like you mentioned, Iran and Mossadegh, Kermit Roosevelt. Like something's going on there now. The totality of which I don't know. Maybe you probably might know better, but I mean, this book is very relevant for that because you're seeing these things happen. Same kind of odd things happened in Venezuela, in Syria, where these like how do you get Maduro out of there without a lot of like warfare on the same night? How does this entire I think that the so-called military of Syria was like at least 100 to 200,000. How do you get them all to lay down their arms and collapse the whole system? Like these are things that are very mysterious and kind of connote this kind of like espionage, the application of espionage techniques. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, I would. What I would agree with more, I think that your remark contains the germ of a broader observation, and I think it raises a really interesting question. And I think implicit in your question, tell me if I got this wrong, is what's the relationship between the old Cold War and the world we're living in now? Because it's only really about 35 years ago. Okay. And is that
Yes, I
something?
think so. Yeah, I think
Okay.
that's a
Okay.
great
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So, uh, so a number of scholars of international relations have been saying since about 2014, about the time that Russia took Crimea away from Ukraine, that we are now in something called the new Cold War. That just as in the old Cold War, there were three superpowers contending for global hegemony, Beijing, Moscow, and Washington. So we're back in the same array of superpowers. And just as Beijing and Moscow were allied and aligned for much of the old Cold War, so they are now so aligned today. So we're kind of fighting a new Cold War. All right. And so if so, and I think that's a reasonable proposition, many scholars, and I think most scholars agree. There's nobody that really disagrees. So the question then is, what are the lessons of history, such as they might be, from the old Cold War for the new? And I think there's a very important one that places Trump's foreign policy in context and allows it to kind of assess it critically. Okay. Now, if you recall the geopolitics that I described at the beginning, I said that the book has two dimensions: one covert operation, the other geopolitics. The basic geopolitical design of the U.S. strategy in the Cold War was very simple. Okay. The generation of World War II veterans who led us in the Cold War understood intuitively that the epicenter of global power is the vast Eurasian continent. It stretches for 6,000 miles. It's the home to 70%, that's 70% of the human population and productivity. The rest of the world are kind of like Greenland, Iceland, North America, South America, Australia, Antarctica. They're lesser islands, okay? So the epicenter of global power for the last 1,000 years has rested on control of Eurasia. And at the end of World War II, we captured two axial ends of Eurasia in defeating the fascist powers. We established our control over Western Europe, and we established through 5 bilateral military pacts a control over the Pacific littoral from Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, all the way down to Australia.
CETO, right? Is that right?
Yeah, CETO, and yeah, but more importantly, these bilateral military pacts, multilateral pact in Europe, bilateral pact with these 5 critical Asia Pacific powers. Okay, and that gave us control over what scholars have called the axial ends of Eurasia. From there, we could position ourselves to control Eurasia and isolate the Sino-Soviet bloc behind the Iron Curtain. All right, and then our basic strategy, as I've described, is when Moscow tried to break out of that geopolitical isolation and get involved in third world countries from the Philippines through South Vietnam all the way to Latin America, the United States sent these covert operatives to knock them back. Okay, but so the key to our Cold War victory was to lock up the Sino-Soviet bloc behind the Iron Curtain And then we had the whole rest of the world as the free world. And you know, and the last, well, I mean, the last time the Soviets broke out is they sent 100,000 troops into Afghanistan because their communist clients were mismanaging the government. The CIA sent one covert operative, a man on the spot called a veteran operative called Howard Hart, and he created an army of 250,000 Afghani guerrillas. And for 10 years, they bloodied and demoralized the Soviet Red Army. And they pulled out in early 1989. Okay. The Soviet Red Army was so defeated and demoralized that in just a matter of months, 7, 8 months later, suddenly there were these mass protests that began erupting in Eastern Europe. Now, always in the past, Poland 1953, Hungary 1956, Czechoslovakia, Prague in 1968. Whenever the democracy protests erupted, the Red Army was sent. Tanks by the thousands would roll through the streets and crush protests. But this time, when Eastern Europe erupted in protest, the Red Army was unable or unwilling to move. The satellite nations of Eastern Europe broke free. The satellite states, the republics of the Soviet Union broke away, and the Soviet Union collapsed, and we won the Cold War. Okay, so the key to the whole strategy was dominance over Eurasia. Now, what is the Trump administration's policy for fighting the new Cold War? Let's think about what they're doing. If we look at the national security strategy released by the Trump administration last November, and you look at the actions by the Trump administration, you look at the things they do and their formal policy, and what you see is this, that instead of this global position of arraying forces around the Eurasian landmass to maintain our position, and if not our dominance in the Eurasian landmass, what the Trump administration is doing is they're practicing a kind of tricontinental policy. Putin and the Russians dominant in the old Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia. China dominant in Eastern Asia, and the United States, and this is very expressly stated in the White House National Security Strategy of November 2025, pulling military forces out of Europe, concentrating our forces in the Americas and turning the Americas into the U.S. sphere. And the strategy says the United States must be dominant in this sphere. And if you think about everything that Trump has done, okay, the idea of making Canada the 51st state, of claiming Greenland, of insisting that the Panamanians kick the Chinese out of the canal, okay, the foray down to Venezuela, the concentration of forces in the Caribbean, all of that is this strategy. And if history teaches us any lesson, okay, is that withdrawing from the Eurasian landmass at this time of the new Cold War, okay, if staying strong on Eurasia gave us victory in the old Cold War, what's the likely consequence of retreating from Eurasia, pulling back to the Americas in the midst of a new Cold War? I think it will be, logically enough, a grinding, humiliating defeat, and clearing the global arena for these two revisionist powers, China and Russia, to dominate Eurasia and thereby dominate the world. And that's a serious matter.
Yeah, it's something else. I mean, with this Silk Road or Belt and Road initiatives and all this thing, the Mackinder thesis is still relevant, right? I mean, it's this whole thing.
Look, nations, empires, rulers come and go, but landforms and the geopolitics that they dictate are constants, and for 1,000 years, Eurasia has been the epicenter of world history. Every empire that's risen or fallen over the last 1,000 years has contended for control over Eurasia. And to unilaterally retreat is just bizarre.
Yeah, it's different now. Yeah. It seems like it. I mean, it seems like Trump is very much not interested in the Europeans, and that document you mentioned last year, it doesn't involve them. They're like almost like
he describes them more or less as betraying their cultural heritage because of the arrival of non-European immigrants. It's the kind of white nationalist idea that the diluting of the blood of the native stock, it leads to cultural degeneration and the decline of civilization. It's a kind of classic fascist blood and land thesis. I mean, that's what it is. I don't like the pejorative, but that's what it is.
Yeah, I think you're right. Professor, we are at the hour mark. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Where can people find Cold War on Five Continents?
Amazon.com. It's right
So
there. Just type it in.
Type it in, and it's also available on Kindle, hardcover. Like I said,
Yep.
it was released on January 6th of 2026, right?
Yeah, and the Kindle price, which is heavily discounted, is, I hate to sound crassly commercial, but it's only $9. All right.
You can get it now and read through it, guys. This is a great overview of late 20th century history, a very expansive view, and from a very illustrious scholar and professor. So, where can people, if people have any further questions or want to reach out to you, do you have social media or anything like that?
No, if you Google my name, you'll get to the University of Wisconsin, and there's my email address. Like all academics at the University of Wisconsin, I serve the people of Wisconsin and the states beyond. So generally, if you write me an email, I'll write you back. I tend to write about half a dozen, replies. Okay.
Right.
But one caveat, okay? If it's school kids writing an essay, you got to be from Wisconsin. If you're outside the state, well, I'm sorry, there's just too many school kids and too many assignments for me to handle in better. If you're from Wisconsin, I'll answer your questions.
Here's a question from the chat, the listeners. Paul asked, does Professor McCoy believe that President Kennedy was trying to lower the Cold War tensions, but the CIA and military leaders were against him? Would you like to answer that?
William, let me just say this. As someone whose career has been made by documenting covert operations and machinations by covert operatives, I'm studying bureaucratic behavior. I'm not engaged in conspiracies. And when you touch the Kennedy administration, you fall down a rabbit hole so deep you'll never get out. And so, though I mourn the passing of a great American president, I don't address his assassination. You got to maintain some kind of objectivity to do the analytical work I need to do. And I'm sorry I can't answer the question.
That's fine. That's very fair. Thanks so much for your time. Again, the guest is Professor and Dr. Alfred W. McCoy, MCCOY, and his new book is Cold War on Five Continents, A Global History of Empire and Espionage. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
William, you've been terrific. Thank you.
All right, stay